What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. All right. So when it comes to Wilt Chamberlain, most videos on YouTube talk about, his NBA career, his incredible statistical accomplishments, his rivalry with Bill Russell or even Kareem, his place in history, whether he's overrated, whether he's underrated, how he would do today in the NBA. If it's off the court stuff, it talks about his, the 20,000 women and, sexual prowess or, the superhuman feats of strength that he apparently showed in his lifetime and things of that nature. But this video, this might be unique. I don't know if there's a video like this on YouTube. I want to talk about his political views because I don't think this is something that gets talked about a lot in today's world. Um, when he was alive, it was well known and well documented that he was a Republican. In a Roy Firestone interview back in 1987, he called himself an ultra conservative. And, you know, infamously, in 1968, he endorsed Richard Nixon for president. In this picture here is Nixon and Nixon's, at the time, vice presidential running mate, Spiro Agnew. And Nixon, Wilt got a lot of flack for that. Okay, a lot of flack. Jim Brown, Kareem. Later, well, yeah, I'll say Kareem. But even though Kareem wasn't in the NBA yet at the time, but Kareem later criticized that. Bill Russell, a lot of prominent Black Americans, James Baldwin, uh, even Jackie Robinson, who had endorsed Nixon 8 years earlier, criticized Wilt Chamberlain for endorsing Richard Nixon. Ultimately, Wilt Chamberlain's endorsement didn't do much at all. I think only, what, 13% of Americans, Black Americans, supported Nixon in the election. Um, Nixon was seen as anathema to the Black community, you know. Uh, and Nixon was a racist, okay? H.R. Haldeman, in his biography uh, in 1982, quoted Nixon as saying that he believed, Nixon said to him that he thought that Black people were genetically inferior. And that it's a lot of shit that he said. But Nixon was indeed a racist. Um, he was anti Semitic, he was misogynistic, he was all those things. Um, and I think the natural tendency would be, upon hearing this, to look at Wilt Chamberlain as a sellout and a coon and all that. But I want people to look at Wilt not through the prism of today, but through the prism of his time and looking at the history of both parties. Now, the Democratic Party was founded in 1832 by Andrew Jackson, all right, who was the current president at that time. The Democratic Party was basically an offshoot of the old Democratic Republican Party founded by Thomas Jefferson. Now, Andrew Jackson was a slave owner, okay? So it would be behooving to the Democratic Party to uphold the lifestyle or the culture of the South, which is where the Democratic Party was based. So, of course, they were pro slavery. The Democratic Party was also, basically made up of people like farmers, landowners, plantation owners, lower income workers. They were seen as the party of the people. Initially, the party that opposed the Democrats was the Whig Party. Okay, WHIG, Whig Party. And but what broke up the Whigs by the late 1850s was the issue of slavery. Some Whigs were opposed to slavery, some were for it. The ones who were for it, many of them ultimately joined the Democratic Party. But the Whigs who were against slavery formed the Republican Party. All right. One of these former Whigs who became Republican was Abraham Lincoln. Now, by definition, and by today's standards, Lincoln would be a cold stone racist. All right. For his times, he was maybe moderate on the race issue. Uh, there's too much romanticizing about Lincoln in today's world, making him out to be this liberal, which he wasn't. But make a long story short, I don't want to be too overly detailed in this video because it would trust me if I got really detailed about this video could probably go for 2 hours, and I wouldn't even realize I talked that damn long. I don't want to bore you, but basically, we all know about the Civil War, and because of what happened in the Civil War and the after effects of the Civil War, Lincoln is seen as for black people. Okay, that's an overly simplistic view of it, but because of that, from the limited times where black people could vote, which was during Reconstruction, uh, during Andrew Johnson's administration, and especially Ulysses S. Grant administration, and then after Reconstruction, when Jim Crow set in the South, and was more the few black people who could vote. Generally speaking, they voted Republican out of loyalty to Lincoln and the Republican Party. Okay, this trend would last until the 1930s. Um, Although, even with that, there were still some Northern blacks who would vote Democratic because both parties at that time had larger tents. Now, most black people voted Republican, but not all, because we're not a monolith. At least we never were. And we voted more on issues. But there were some people who voted out of tradition, which is a problem that I think we have today, is that we vote too much out of tradition and sometimes out of peer pressure, but not on the issue. But anyway, this trend of blacks voting Republican started ending in the 1930s. Why is that? Well, part of it was because of the Great Depression. Well, most of it was because of the Great Depression. The Great Depression, you heard the expression, when white people have a cold, black people get pneumonia. Well, the Great Depression was very, very disastrous to black Americans. Okay. Um, you couple that with the fact that when we were doing well economically for ourselves in select cities and were allowed to thrive, anti-black sentiment would lead to things like Rosewood and Tulsa. You know, uh, it would lead to these great tragedies where white racists, out of jealousy, would destroy black businesses, ruining what could have been generational wealth. Scores of generational wealth handed toward black people in secession. Even the Wilmington Massacre, 1898, the Wilmington Insurrection of 1898, uh, they actually overthrew a multicultural government, which was led by whites and blacks at that time. They actually took the seats, ran black people out of the city and out of government, and that happened throughout the South and throughout this country, not even the South, but in other places. So By the 1930s, Black Americans were hurting, and the New Deal programs under Roosevelt did help a lot of Black Americans. And you saw a switch of allegiance with blacks going from Republican to Democrat, at least on the national level. Now, on local levels, black people still may have been voting Republican on state and local elections. Um, so it's more complicated than how it than some way you might read. Okay, but I'm talking more on a national level. In the 1940s, more or less, Black Americans were voting Democratic, um, but the Republican Party was still competitive, and they still routinely got 30 to 40% of the vote nationally in elections. Sometimes in local elections, they won the black vote, especially in cities like Philadelphia, New York City. They still were getting good portions of the African American vote, but this was changing. But in the 1950s, the Democratic Party was increasingly being dominated by the Northern progressive wing of the party. And you were seeing this being influenced by policy, domestic policy coming out of the White House. Truman, for instance, uh, he desegregated the federal government, so more and more black employees were being hired for positions, you know, federal jobs. He desegregated the armed forces. This angered a lot of Dixiecrats. Dixiecrats, by the way, if you're not familiar with that term, were Southerners who opposed the equality of black people in everyday society. They wanted to uphold white supremacy and Jim Crow. All right, they believed in quote unquote separation of the races, but in reality, what they wanted to uphold was white supremacy. Okay, even though sometimes when it comes to political uh, issues, many of them were liberal socially. Give you an example: Huey Long, right, the Kingfish of Louisiana, governor, ran Louisiana, basically was the dictator of that state, governor, then senator, before he was assassinated in 1935. He was basically a socialist, but he received a lot of wide support from whites and some blacks, even though he generally was seen as a white supremacist. So it's deeper. The issue is really deeper than white people, conservative, uh, Republican, white people, liberal, Democrats. It's not that simple. It's not that simple in a lot of ways. Okay, but anyway, Will Cheney was born in 1936 in Pennsylvania. So I would imagine from what I could tell is he came from a pretty well-to-do family for that time. I would assume his family were ancestral Republicans, going back to, like I said, loyalty to the Republican Party because of Lincoln and all that shit. Um, they probably, however, were culturally conservative. Okay, um, you know, I don't know his family's background as far as wealth, but Wilt seemed to come from for the times, a relatively prosperous black family. He also seemed to have a lot of white friends growing up for a black man. Okay. Um, so I'm pretty sure these had some influences on him politically or his way of thinking. Contrast that with Bill Russell, who grew up in the Deep South until he was a preteen. Then he moved to California after the death of his mother. But this is a guy that was born in Monroe, Louisiana, in the heart of Jim Crow. You know what I'm saying? A lot of the black athletes grew up in the Deep South, or they grew up in, Oscar Robertson grew up in Tennessee. They grew up in that oppression of the Deep South, and that helped to, form their views on race. Wilt had a slightly, from what I can tell now, I'm not saying Wilt didn't have issues with racism, but I think his upbringing was slightly different, which led to his different perspective. Um, Now let's fast forward a little bit. 1968. Apparently, Wilt had been an admirer of Nixon for a while, I guess, and I think that comes from the fact that you got to remember something about Nixon. They didn't call him Tricky Dick for nothing. Okay, Nixon was a master dissembler, and by that I mean he uh, knew what to say to a person after either observing them or getting some type of study of them. Okay, so he knew what to say to a person and give him a certain side of him or what he wanted to show that particular person. Now Nixon, when he was vice president, had came out in favor of civil rights. In fact, he helped to push a bill that ultimately failed in Congress that would have been, even though it would have been much weaker than the 64 bill, some form of civil rights bill. But let's be honest about something. Nixon was a politician, so he's going to do whatever it took to get votes. At that time, it was smart for Republicans because there were a lot of moderate Republicans, and the moderate wing of the Democratic Party was in control, and you had a lot of black Republicans at that time still. So it made sense for Nixon to be, quotes, pro civil rights. But after the civil rights movement and the Republican Party saw the writing on the wall, LBJ getting 94% of the black vote, and the trend was against the GOP to make inroads, that's when they shifted strategies, the Republican Party, and tried to court uh, mainly uh, white Southerners who resented the civil rights movement and the changes. But the Southern strategy is a little bit of an oversimplification because the Republicans also got a lot of blue collar support, at least on the national level as well. These traditional blue collar white workers who had been part of the New Deal coalition since FDR broke away by the late 60s and started voting for people like Nixon and Republicans. You know, interesting because the Republican Party used to be considered the party of the rich, right? But now, how much things have changed, rich people generally vote more liberal. And it's the lower income white people who vote Republican. When it used to be reversed 40, 50 years ago. It's interesting. It's like that's how much they have taken over the Republican Party, the former would be, I guess, Dixiecrats. But back to Wilt Chamberlain, though, man. I think Wilt was just, in my opinion, man, I think he's a good guy. I don't think he was a sellout. I think that he was just naive in certain things. You know what I'm saying? I think he was very naive. Um, Nixon was a racist. Now, Wilt was correct in having his dislike about Reagan and the first Bush. I agree with that 100%. I wonder in today's world whether Wilt would be a Republican. I don't think he would be. I'm certain of that. I think he would probably be more of a, when you consider how far right the leadership of the Democratic Party is today, um, I think he would either be a, I think he would tepidly endorse the Democrats, knowing Wilt, or he'd be a libertarian. Um, I don't think he'd be a Republican by today's standards. When you look at his stances, I remember reading that he was for regulation of prostitution and marijuana. He thought these things should be legal but controlled. That doesn't sound like a conservative from today. You know what I'm saying? That sounds like somebody from the 50s and 60s that might have been conservative when it came to how government works, and they might have been conservative when it comes to foreign policy, but they may have been moderate when it came to social issues. Whereas today, a lot of these motherfuckers don't know a fucking thing about and don't care about foreign policy. If you ask them about how they feel like government should be structured and work, they don't know what the fuck they're talking about. You know what I'm saying? Or they don't know what you're talking about and don't talk about it in detail. But when it comes to social issues, abortion, race, and all that, religion, they'll claim to be conservatives, but in reality, in a lot of ways, they're really not conservative. You know what I'm saying? Um, but that's pretty much it, man. I do want to say this about Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson did endorse Richard Nixon for president in 1960 over John F. Kennedy. His reasonings being because, like I said before, Nixon had been known before the early 60s as supposedly a friend of the black community, when in reality he really was. He was just a political opportunist. But he supported Nixon because he didn't trust Kennedy. Because Kennedy, number one, was still very lukewarm about the civil rights issue. He didn't really want to touch it. He didn't really want to talk about it. Kennedy also was very um, concerned about retaining the bleeding support from Dixiecrats, right? So he would meet with these segregationists. He tried to cater to them. That bothered Jackie Robinson, okay? Even though, the Republicans and Nixon, they were trying to cater to them too, but Kennedy was doing it more overtly. So he went out and supported Nixon. He grew to regret that because he found out that Nixon was not genuine. He began to find out that Nixon was a racist. He began to find out that Nixon was a country club bigot and all these different things. And by 1968, Hubert Humphrey, who was a liberal, an unabashed liberal, uh, Jackie Robinson, who had been a registered Republican, came out in full support of Hubert Humphrey. And I wouldn't be surprised if before Jackie Robinson died in 1972, he had switched allegiances to the Democratic Party. Jackie Robinson had also come out before he died and was very critical of the so-called liberal wing of the Republican Party, the liberal wing of the Republican Party, because they were not being as vociferous as he thought they should be on racism. Now, these are people who consider themselves liberal socially, right? Like I said, on economics, on government philosophy, they were conservative. But on social issues, the Nelson Rockefellers and the Jacob Javits and the John Lindsays, they were supposedly liberal. But when it came to race, they weren't saying much. And this was infuriating the last few remaining black Republicans to the point where they left the party. And then afterward, you know, to me, and this is just my opinion, I didn't quite understand how a black man in this country could be a Republican after the 70s. I just couldn't quite understand it just based upon what was happening with the Republican Party. There was a slow takeover of the conservative wing of the Republican Party. after Barry Goldwater's landslide defeat in '64. You look at the nominees. Okay, after Nixon, after Watergate, it was Gerald Ford, who was a moderate, right? But he was forced to dump Rockefeller, who was seen as a liberal, and nominate Bob Dole, who was a conservative. And remember, Ford narrowly beat Ronald Reagan for the nomination in '76 altogether. Then in '80, Ford lost in '76. Then in '80, they nominate Reagan, who was seen as an arch conservative. He had to run to balance the ticket. He had to run with a guy who was perceived as more moderate, Bush. They won. Uh, then in '88, Bush took the mantle for Reagan, ran with Dan Quayle, who was more conservative from Indiana, a very conservative state. Uh, they won. They lost re-election mostly because of the economy. But then by the '90s, you really saw a takeover of the conservative wing of the Republican Party. Bob Dole was a moderate conservative. Jack Kemp was a conservative. Bush and Cheney were both very conservative. You know what I'm saying? And since then, McCain was a maverick, but he had to really pivot to the right to get the nomination. So did Romney. Romney had to pivot to the right to get the nomination. Trump went way to the right. So my point is, the Republican Party has been taken over by the extreme right wing, now like fringe uh, right elements have taken over the Republican Party. And interestingly, though, the Democratic Party has not been taken over by the extreme left, because to me, this country is not really left center. Not really. To me, the people who are in control of the Democratic Party are people who arguably would have been considered moderate Republicans in the past. People like Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar, uh, Joe Biden. He's not really a fucking liberal. Not a liberal. This guy used to associate with segregationists in the past. Okay, people like Jesse Helms, who was Republican, and J. Strom Thurmond, who was a Democrat turned Republican. Orville Fathers, uh, William Fulbright, and others. He would associate with them. Not Harry Byrd, uh, Robert Byrd, and others. Byrd was a former Klansman. Um, so that's pretty much it, and pretty much all I got to say in this video. Tell me what you guys think.